Today we wanted to highlight some video games that are based on true stories. We've rounded up some unique games that have set out to portray like a real story, a real character, or a real location in some shape or form. Because yes, Assassin's Creed has George Washington and Leonardo da Vinci in it, but we wanted to talk about some games that aim to take it a step further. This list was tricky. I want to point out that like no game is 100% based on a true story, but we chose 8 specific games that kind of have a different approach, that kind of do something unique, that really try in interesting ways. Some of these are really unique experiences that had unique work put into them that aren't highlighted enough, so buckle up. Let's get started off with number 8. This first one is a bit of a bummer, but just because something is a bummer doesn't mean that it shouldn't be experienced or talked about. And That Dragon Cancer is a perfect example. Made by a very small team that included Ryan and Amy Green, That Dragon Cancer is an autobiographical game about the Greens raising their 12-month-old child who has been diagnosed with terminal cancer. It plays like a point-and-click adventure where you play as both Amy and Ryan in 14 different small vignettes that essentially take you through the highs and lows of their experiences. Both of them narrate the game as well, along with other family members, and it also includes recordings that were made during all of this. They definitely got a bit abstract with it and kind of made some of their real life experiences into these kind of fantastical visions and moments, but it doesn't change the impact of what's going on, what they're trying to explain, and the feelings they're trying to convey. I'm sure making a game like this can't be easy, you know? Dealing with something like that is harder than a lot of us can imagine. So we commend the Greens for being able to share a story like that, a very personal and real story with us. There's also a documentary called Thank You for Playing that they released that documents the development of the game and the last few years they got to spend with their child, and that's worth a watch too. Now over at number 7, we have Noire. Definitely a change of pace. The story itself and Cole Phelps, yes, is not true, but there are things in the game that are definitely based off of real life things that they put a lot of work into, and we wanted to point out. For one, Los Angeles itself. Rockstar's version of 1940s Los Angeles is spot on. There are real-world buildings, there are painstaking recreations, and it also did a great job of showing us post-World War II America, something you don't really experience in games. I mean, the game opens up with the narrator talking about owning a suburban home, and many big suburbs were a direct product of World War II. After the war, the economy in America improved, and people had the money to be able to afford their own suburban home, and the game did a very good job of showcasing that. They nailed not only the look of the time, but the overall vibe. Consumerism was the name of the game at the time, and that's what Rockstar really pushed. Then, of course, there's the inclusion of some real-life cases. This is kind of why we wanted to point this out. The Black Dahlia murder is a pretty big case in LA Noire. I'm sure a lot of you know about that one by now. It's pretty notorious in terms of crime cases, and you investigate that case in LA Noire, and there's a really cool twist, actually. I won't get into it because it's definitely a game that's still worth playing, so maybe go play it. Again, definitely not the most true story game on our list, but we think that those specific aspects, you know, the ones that they really worked hard on and the things they tried to replicate, aren't talked about enough, and we wanted to highlight them. Now over at number 6, we have Brothers in Arms Road to Hill 30, which is based on the true story of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne Division. These were the guys who were dropped behind enemy lines on D-Day. So you, the player, start the game off as Sergeant Matthew Baker and take part in the real-life Mission Albany, and you play through different missions that are all based on real-life scenarios. Now, according to some heads at Gearbox, the development team really did their research for this game, looking up real-life soldiers and trying to actually recreate certain parts of 1944 Normandy, where they could, from streets to battlefields, and for its tactical gameplay, they actually worked with retired Army Colonel John Antal. He was there to make sure that this was as authentic as possible, and they must have done a really good job because History Channel used footage from the game in one of their specials, which was oddly enough titled Brothers in Arms. Now next at number 5, we have Vampire Legends, the true story of Kisilova. This one takes place in 18th century Europe in a small, remote Serbian town called Kisilova. There are a few horrifying and also unexplainable deaths that are happening in town, and you play as the person who is investigating these deaths and trying to find out what's going on. Now, it seems like a neat little point-and-click adventure game with a bunch of fun little mini-games tossed in, but the developers claim that it's based on the first documented case of vampirism. Now, it's tricky to actually lock down which one they're referring to. There are multiple, first early cases cases of claims of vampires out there in the world. It could be either Petar Blagojevich or Jure Grando, which I'm sorry, I'm probably butchering those names, but Grando died in 1656 in the town of Kringa and was said to have returned from the grave at night as a vampire to terrorize the town, and this went on until 1672. Now, Petar Blagojevich died in 1752 in the what is now known as town of Kiselevo. So honestly, we're not too sure, which they're referring to, but vampires are really cool, and the way they intersect with real-life legends and lore is really cool, and frankly, there's no other games that set out to do this type of thing and try and base it on some sort of realistic old-world account. And our objective was to point out unique games here, so we're definitely doing that with Vampire Legends. Now, over at number 4, The Town of Light is an interesting one because the story it tells of Renee, an ex-patient of the Volterra Psychiatric Hospital in 1940s Italy, is actually totally fictional, but the setting itself is very cool. Founded in 1888 and shutting down in 1978, Volterra Psychiatric Hospital was very real and is known for how horribly they treated their patients. It was actually referred to as the place of no return because supposedly patients were never able to return home. So while the story itself is entirely fictional, it is based off of diary entries and from stories that were told by ex-staff members. So they wrote it with a knowledge of what was actually going on there and used that very closely. Supposedly, the hospital was infamous for their use of electroshock therapy, as well as hiding letters from family and keeping patients tied to their beds in straitjackets. Everything I've read about the game and the place seems very dark. A lot of it is too much to mention here, so go check it out for yourself. Also, if you're into photography and photos of old stuff, definitely look up pictures of the Volterra Psychiatric Hospital. It's very creepy. Now coming down to number 3, we have Annunaki Tunnel, a horror game that takes place in the Annunaki Tunnel, which is based off of the real-life location. There was a murder that happened at this tunnel where a young engineer had his car stolen by a group of teenagers, and they tortured him and beat him, eventually killing him, and then dousing him in gasoline and setting him on fire. That really escalated quickly. Since then, the tunnel was shut and is no longer open. That was it. And people claim to hear voices around it, or when they sneak in, they can feel a hand on their chest. You know, really a bunch of urban legend type stuff. A lot of towns in America have this too. But yeah, when you look up photos and video of people walking through, it is a very creepy looking place, and so is this game. The game is pretty much a walking simulator type thing with puzzles, and it also kind of has a Blair Witch Project vibe, with it being filmed a VHS camera and like it's being watched on a CRT screen. This is definitely one that's not for the faint of heart. If you don't do horror stuff, definitely maybe stay away. But still, we thought it was definitely worth highlighting because it is focused around a real world event and a real urban legend. Yes, we can definitely question the ethics of making a horror video game based around the site where somebody actually maybe died. But yeah, let's move on. Now over at number 2, we have 1979 Revolution, Black Friday, which, if you can't tell by the title, has something to do with the Iranian Revolution. I mean, Black Friday was an actual thing that happened. In 1978, a little over 80 people were killed, with hundreds and maybe even thousands more were injured when the Pahlavi military opened fire on a crowd of protesters. In this game, you play as Reza Shirazi, a journalist who returns to Iran during the revolution. It kind of plays like a Telltale game with you making timed choices, whether it be a response to someone or you deciding whether or not to take action, like being at a protest and deciding whether you're going to take part in it and throw a rock, or maybe hang back and take photos. And what's cool is the pictures you take will often get compared to a real photo that was taken during the Iranian Revolution. The game's director, Navid Kansari, actually was growing up during the revolution and actually witnessed a lot of these real-life events that would later go on to inspire the game. Not a lot of games like this exist, but it's important that they do because they can give some real insight into terrible things that have happened throughout the world. You may not have ever thought about it, but through video games, it's actually a nice way to, make sure, number 1, you never forget, and number 2, maybe actually learn something about what happened and just how it felt to live through that. Now, down to number 1, we're talking about Kolat. This is an exploration adventure game where you play as someone investigating the location of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Dyatlov Pass incident, but it's terrifying as hell. 9 hikers went off into the northern Ural Mountains in February of 1959. They set up their camp on the slopes of Kholat Syakhy, and that night, something forced them to flee their tents very quickly, which led to them not being dressed appropriately to combat the cold of the Ural Mountains. Sadly, all 9 hikers died, 6 from hypothermia, and the other 3 from physical trauma. One had a fractured skull, the other 2 had chest fractures, and one was missing both eyes, and one was missing a tongue. So, really terrifying, really questionable stuff. Eventually, the investigation ended, and the deaths were chalked up to, and I quote, compelling natural force. But, man, I don't know, something crazy definitely went on there. And in the game, which is an okay game, but it's based on an interesting premise, you play as the person that goes back into the Ural Mountains to find the truth, which is a big no. No thanks. Yikes. That's spooky. Oh, and also, it's worth mentioning that the character is narrated by Sean Bean himself, good old Scene Bean, which is really cool. One does not simply walk into the Ural Mountains. I should probably stop. That's awful. Anyway, we wanted to highlight some games that are based on true things, true stories, true locations, true moments. This lister is tricky to make, so like I said, we'd want to hear from you guys any other examples you had down in the comments. Do you have any urban legend stories that you would love to be turned into a game? Let us know. That could be fun. But if you enjoyed this video, clicking the like button is the best way you can help us out. And maybe if you're new, consider subscribing because we put out videos of all different kinds every single day. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.